The chamber was silent when the words were spoken. You cannot claim to be the United Nations while disregarding the voice of 54 nations. It was not a cry of anger but of truth, sharp, undeniable, and deeply unsettling. For 2 decades, Africa has been knocking on the doors of the highest council of global governance, demanding representation, fairness, and justice. And for 2 decades, those doors have remained closed. 80 years ago, in the ashes of World War II, the world built the United Nations as a shield against another global catastrophe. The promise was bold. Never again would nations be left voiceless. Never again would humanity suffer from a world order designed for the few. Yet here we are in 2025 still debating whether Africa, the continent of 1.4 billion people, deserves a permanent seat at the table where decisions about its wars, its peacekeepers, and its future are made. The president of Kenya, standing before the 80th General Assembly, did not mince his words. He reminded the world that exclusion is not just unfair, it is dangerous. Just as the League of Nations collapsed before World War II because it failed to adapt the United Nations to, risks drifting into irrelevance if it refuses to reform. So we must ask ourselves, has the UN already lost its way? Can an institution still call itself united when it silences an entire continent? And perhaps the hardest question of all, what happens when Africa decides it will no longer wait? For those of us watching from afar, the warning is clear. History does not repeat itself gently. It shouts, it rattles, it warns us that the legitimacy of global institutions cannot be postponed. Do you believe the United Nations can survive another decade without giving Africa its rightful place? Please share your thoughts below. And if you believe that truth matters more than political convenience, subscribe because stories like this are shaping the future, and you deserve to hear them first. It began not with applause but with a warning. As the world gathered in New York to mark the 80th anniversary of the United Nations, one voice broke the ceremonial rhythm. The president of Kenya, speaking not just for his nation, but for an entire continent, declared what Africa had been saying for 20 years: enough. For 2 decades, the Ezulwini Consensus and the Sirte Declaration, 2 historic African positions, have demanded reform of the UN Security Council. At their heart, the demand is simple: Africa must no longer be the only continent without a permanent seat at the table where global peace and security are decided. While Europe holds 2 permanent seats and Asia and the Americas are represented, Africa remains on the margins, forced to plead for influence in decisions that affect its very survival. Think about the weight of that injustice. Africa contributes some of the largest contingents of UN peacekeepers. Its people bear the brunt of wars and instability that dominate the Council's agenda. And yet, when the final decisions are taken, Africa is absent. The chamber in New York may host 193 nations, but when the Security Council closes its doors, only 5 voices truly matter. And Africa's is not among them. The president's words cut through decades of polite diplomacy. Africa is no longer willing to wait. It was a declaration that the patience of 54 nations had expired. This was not merely a complaint about procedure, it was a direct challenge to the legitimacy of the UN itself. How can an organization claim to represent humanity when it excludes 1/5 of the world's population? To reinforce his point, the president drew from history. The League of Nations, created after World War I, had noble ambitions, but collapsed because it failed to adapt. It stood helpless when Italy invaded Ethiopia, when Japan marched into Manchuria, and when Hitler defied international law. Its voice carried no weight, its authority no respect. By the late 1930s, it had lost all credibility. The lesson is clear: institutions do not fail because they lack vision. They fail when they refuse to reform. Today, the United Nations stands at a similar crossroads. 80 years after its founding, it is being tested by wars in Ukraine, Gaza, Sudan, Somalia, and the Sahel. It is being tested by pandemics, climate disasters, and an international financial system that rewards the rich and punishes the poor. At the very moment the world needs a strong, legitimate UN, the organization finds itself paralyzed, frozen in the post-war structures of 1945. The president reminded the assembly that Africa has spoken in one voice for 20 years. The demand is precise: at least 2 permanent seats with full rights, including veto power, and 2 additional non-permanent seats on the Security Council. This is not charity. It is not a favor. It is the bare minimum required to restore the credibility of the United Nations. Without it, the UN risks becoming the very thing it was created to replace, a relic of another age, incapable of meeting the demands of the present. What made the moment even more striking was the context. Around the chamber sat the leaders of nations that still cling to the privileges of 1945. To grant Africa its rightful place would mean sharing power, losing the monopoly that has defined international order for nearly a century. But the president's words left no room for compromise. The status quo, he insisted, is not just unfair, it is unsustainable. As the speech echoed through the hall, the weight of history hung heavy. 80 years ago, the world promised that we, the peoples of the United Nations, would never again leave humanity defenseless. But in 2025, with 1/5 of the world's population excluded from the highest council, the cracks in that promise are now impossible to ignore. The air in the chamber grew heavier as the president of Kenya shifted from history to warning. His voice did not rise in anger, but in conviction. He invoked the ghost of the League of Nations, the failed body that collapsed under its own irrelevance. Institutions rarely fail because they lack ideals, he said. They fail when they refuse to adapt, when they hesitate to act, when they lose legitimacy. The parallel was unmistakable. The United Nations, like its predecessor, risks becoming a hollow symbol if it continues to ignore Africa's rightful demand. At that moment, the speech reached its peak. With the eyes of the world upon him, the president declared what no African leader at this level had dared to say so bluntly: Africa is no longer willing to wait. It was not a plea, nor a request for sympathy. It was a line drawn in the sand. For 80 years, Africa had been patient. For 20 years, it had spoken in one voice through the Eswatini Consensus. Now, the time for patience had ended. The climax of his address came with an unambiguous demand: 2 permanent seats for Africa on the UN Security Council with full rights, including the veto, and 2 additional non-permanent seats. The silence that followed was not just a pause, it was a reckoning. Diplomats shifted in their chairs, some scribbled notes, others avoided eye contact. The message was too direct to ignore, yet too explosive to acknowledge openly. In that silence, you could feel the fracture lines of global politics. For Western powers, the call was uncomfortable. To grant Africa permanent seats would mean redistributing power, a privilege guarded fiercely since 1945. For emerging powers like India, Brazil, and others in the global south, the demand resonated. Africa's case was not only just, it was inevitable. And for the African delegates present, the words carried the weight of vindication. At last, someone had said it aloud in the world's grandest hall: Africa would no longer stand outside the doors of power. International reactions quickly rippled beyond the chamber. News outlets highlighted the comparison with the League of Nations, a historical analogy that struck deep. Analysts in Washington and Brussels cautioned that if the UN fails to adapt, Africa might increasingly look to alternative alliances, BRICS, the African Union, or new regional blocs like the Alliance of Sahel States, to assert its sovereignty. Beijing and Moscow, meanwhile, saw opportunity. They praised Africa's call as a legitimate demand, subtly signaling support for reforms that would weaken Western dominance of global institutions. The emotional impact of the speech was most evident in the African bloc itself. Delegates from Ghana, Nigeria, South Africa, and smaller nations alike rose to applaud. For them, this was not just rhetoric. It was a recognition of decades of sacrifice, troops lost in peacekeeping economies, battered by conflicts they did not start, and entire generations told to wait for fairness that never came. The applause was not thunderous, but it was steady, resolute, and defiant. What gave the climax even more force was the juxtaposition with Africa's concrete steps toward self-reliance. The president reminded the assembly that Africa was already building its own financial institutions, an African central bank to issue a single currency, an African monetary fund to stabilize economies, an African investment bank to finance growth, and an African credit rating agency to tell Africa's story truthfully. The message was clear: Africa was not begging. It was preparing to move forward with or without the UN. And yet beneath the applause and polite nods, a tension lingered. Would the great powers, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, China, ever be willing to share the veto? Would they risk diluting the system that has secured their dominance for 80 years? The question hung unanswered, but the warning was unmistakable. If they did not, the UN would not be reformed, it would be bypassed. The climax of the speech was not just in its words, but in the shift it signaled. Africa was no longer positioning itself as a supplicant at the gates of global governance. It was a continent declaring its arrival. The United Nations could either embrace that reality or watch itself fade like the League of Nations before it into irrelevance. What does exclusion look like on the ground? It is not just a matter of empty speeches in New York. It is the child in Sudan who cannot sleep because the sound of gunfire is closer each night. It is the mother in Haiti who wonders if her son will return from school when gangs rule the streets. It is the farmer in Burkina Faso who sees soldiers from his own village deployed in UN peacekeeping missions, yet his continent has no seat where those missions are authorized. Exclusion is not abstract. It is lived in flesh and blood. The president of Kenya made this plain. Africa is asked to sacrifice but denied a voice. When the IMF allocated billions in special drawing rights during the pandemic, wealthy nations who needed it least took 64%. Poorer nations, many of them in Africa, received just 2.4%. That is not a miscalculation. It is a system designed to perpetuate inequality. While Europe rebuilds with concessional loans and low interest rates, African states are trapped in cycles of debt, borrowing at punishing costs, simply because their creditworthiness is judged by standards set in New York, London, and Paris. The political consequences are severe. In Haiti, Kenya deployed police officers under a UN mandate to stabilize a nation strangled by gang violence. Against all odds, progress was made, roads reopened, schools resumed, kidnappings declined. Yet the mission was chronically underfunded and understaffed, operating at less than 40% of authorized strength. Why? Because when it came time to provide resources, the solidarity of the UN faltered. For the Haitian people, the lesson was bitter. Promises of international support rarely match reality. In Gaza, the devastation has been seared into the world's conscience. Kenya's leader condemned the disproportionate use of force, called for humanitarian law to be applied consistently, and demanded a permanent ceasefire. But here again, the UN has been paralyzed, its blue helmets and resolutions ignored. The humanitarian catastrophe unfolds in plain view while global powers veto resolutions to protect their allies. To ordinary Africans and indeed to ordinary citizens everywhere, the message is disturbing. Some lives are defended, others dismissed. Back in Africa, the war in Sudan drags on, pulling civilians into a conflict they did not choose. Despite declarations and envoys, the UN has been unable to broker peace. External actors fuel divisions, and without decisive reform, the Security Council remains a spectator to tragedy. Each day of inaction deepens the belief that the UN's authority is not just weak, it is selective. This selective justice erodes trust not only in the UN, but in the very idea of multilateralism. When institutions are seen as instruments of the powerful rather than protectors of the vulnerable, people turn elsewhere. That is why Africa is no longer waiting for handouts. By building the African Monetary Fund, the African Central Bank, and the African Investment Bank, the continent is signaling that sovereignty cannot be outsourced. These institutions are more than economic tools. They are political statements. Africa will not be voiceless again. For ordinary citizens, this shift matters. It means that future generations might grow up under systems where their currencies are not devalued by external diktats, where their nations do not collapse under the weight of debts designed by outsiders, and where decisions about their peace and security are made with them, not for them. But until reforms at the UN and in the global financial system are realized, millions remain trapped in the consequences of a world order that sidelines them. The civil and political costs of exclusion are therefore intertwined. On one hand, instability, poverty, and conflict spread in regions left unheard. On the other, the very institutions created to uphold order lose legitimacy. And history teaches us this truth: when legitimacy is lost, collapse is only a matter of time. From Washington's vantage point, the speech at the UN was more than rhetoric. It was a direct challenge to an order that has placed the United States at the center of global decision-making since 1945. For 8 decades, America has defended the structure of the Security Council, knowing that its veto power is the ultimate shield for its interests. To share that privilege with Africa would mean rebalancing influence in ways Washington has never had to consider. But for many Americans, especially those who remember the promises made after World War II, the argument raised by Africa feels familiar. Wasn't the United Nations created to ensure no nation would be silenced? Didn't the US itself fight against tyranny in the name of freedom and representation? The contradiction is stark. To deny Africa representation is to deny the very values America claims to champion. For older generations of Americans who recall the moral clarity of the post-war era, this hypocrisy cannot easily be dismissed. Across the Atlantic, Europe faces its own reckoning. Nations like Britain and France, permanent members of the Security Council, fear that granting Africa a seat would dilute their status. Yet their colonial histories in Africa make resistance even more difficult to justify. How can former colonial powers continue to dominate the very institution that decides Africa's fate? For many in Africa, the image is not one of partnership, but of unfinished empire preserved under the blue flag of the UN. Meanwhile, rising powers outside the West have seized on Africa's demand as a moment of global realignment. China and Russia openly support Africa's push for permanent seats, not only out of solidarity, but also as a way to weaken Western dominance in global governance. For BRICS nations, Brazil, India, South Africa, the argument is clear: if the UN is to reflect today's multipolar world, Africa's absence is indefensible. This puts the United States in a delicate position. To resist reform risks pushing Africa further into the arms of rival blocs. To embrace reform means surrendering a degree of power in an institution that has long been a pillar of American foreign policy. It is not an easy choice, but history suggests that refusing to adapt is the more dangerous path. The collapse of the League of Nations is a reminder of what happens when the powerful cling too tightly to outdated privileges. For ordinary citizens around the world, the speech resonates in another way. It is a call to honesty. People in rural America, in European towns, and in African villages alike know what exclusion feels like. They know the sting of decisions made far away without their voice. When Africa says it will no longer wait, it is not just a regional demand, it is a human one. The global response has therefore been mixed: cautious acknowledgement from the West, enthusiastic support from the global South, and quiet calculation in capitals everywhere. But one fact is undeniable: Africa's call for justice has entered the bloodstream of international politics. It cannot be ignored without consequence. For the United States, the question is pressing. Will America align itself with the principles it once fought for: representation, fairness, dignity, or will it defend a system that leaves 1.4 billion people outside the room? For a nation built on the promise of democracy, the answer will determine not just its credibility abroad, but its moral standing at home. 80 years after its founding, the United Nations now stands at a crossroads. It was born from the ashes of war, carrying the promise that no voice would be silenced again. Yet today, with 54 African nations excluded from the highest table of power, that promise feels dangerously thin. The president of Kenya's words were not just a speech, they were a warning. Institutions do not collapse overnight, they erode piece by piece as trust fades and legitimacy dissolves. That is what happened to the League of Nations, and unless the UN adapts, history may be preparing to repeat itself. For Africa, the message is already clear. If the doors of the UN remain closed, the continent will build its own house through the African Central Bank, the African Monetary Fund, and the African Investment Bank. These are not symbols of defiance, but of survival. They are signals that Africa will no longer ask for permission to shape its destiny. And if the UN refuses to reform, it risks becoming a relic left behind as new centers of power emerge. For the world, and especially for the United States, the consequences are profound. If Africa turns elsewhere, alliances will shift, and Washington may find itself facing a global order where its voice carries less weight. More than that, America would be forced to answer a question uncomfortable but necessary. How long can it preach democracy abroad while resisting it within the very institution designed to uphold it? And for ordinary people, from villages in Burkina Faso to towns in America's Midwest, the stakes are not abstract. They are about peacekeepers who arrive too late, about debt that strangles opportunity, about children growing up under systems that tell them their voices don't count. The future of the UN is not just a matter of diplomacy, it is a matter of human dignity. So tonight I leave you with this. Do you believe that President Ibrahim Traoré's call for sovereignty, justice, and fairness reflects the future Africa deserves? Or do you think the UN in its current form can still deliver on its original promise? The choice, my friends, is not Africa's alone. It is a choice for all of us. Because when one continent is silenced, the entire world grows less safe, less fair, and less united. Please share this message if you feel that Africa's voice must finally be heard. And subscribe if you believe that truth, no matter how uncomfortable, is more important than silence. Because the world is changing fast, and the stories you hear here may be the first warning of the history we are about to live.